Aujourd'hui, je veux parler de, certainly not a rain on anyone's parade, but several key reasons against being a majority real estate investor. At least for me personally, okay? So I am curious whether my reasons are enough for other people, thus this rant here. Hey, Zampak here. Now, pretext is a bit necessary for today's rant. I am not against real estate investing generally, and heck, our own household right now, we do hold real estate that is outside of our primary residence, even. I'm not one of those people who thinks that fire shouldn't include ownership. Okay, on the contrary, I think having a home base in a developed country like the good old US of A is a bare minimum of feeling secure, whether that's the best math decision for fire or not. But what I am going to talk about today is a bit of a Debbie Downer because I think it was part of my own personal fire journey. After all, the US tax code is heavily incentivized for people to go and purchase real estate. So theoretically, wouldn't using mortgage, aka leverage, to amplify our journey to financial independence be a positive thing? Now, I absolutely get that real estate investors make up a very vocal and solid minority of the fire adherents. And I am absolutely not saying that it cannot work for some people. But today, I'm going to give my reasons as to why I think it wouldn't work for a lazy bum like myself, at least. Okay, so if you're intrigued by what I might say, please subscribe, like, comment, and share, and all that social media buzzwords, or whatever, because I am rich enough for me, I'll be great regardless. Okay, so the first real con of real estate investing as an individual anyway, it's the hidden cost, okay? Look, getting income from a relatively reliable source like rent is something that we can all inherently understand, right? I mean, it's obviously not a terrible idea, or else all that, private equity funds of the world that are not driving up rents, in totality, wouldn't be putting their money into it, right? But there's a big difference between larger institutions going to the business of being a landlord versus individual investors trying to do the same, okay? Institutions just have way more layers of redundancies in place to deal with the hidden costs of being a landlord. Those costs can include, but are not limited to, routine repairs, right, general tenant-created chaos, changes in zoning and tax rates, etc., etc. Now, I think when you first look at being a landlord on paper, it can seem pretty passive. You buy a house, you rent it out, money just keeps flowing in, but the reality is that the initial purpose costs, while large, is by no means the only thing that's happening. Now, most people do account for real estate taxes, which can vary wildly depending on location, but ignoring other absolutely recurring costs that may happen more sporadically, like replacing roofs and all sorts of home maintenance issues, right? Those costs are a certainty, but do not occur every year or even every 5 years, right? So it's easy to forget about them. And when they do happen, the costs are usually quite large. So as a landlord, one has to actually stash away liquidity just for those instances, right? Basically similar to a self-imposed tax. Again, if a private equity fund was doing real estate investing, they would know to do that. But for a single individual investor, I'd say this is one of the top you learn as you go type of shockers to deal with, right? So that's something that we all figure out eventually. That's somewhat unexpected. Second thing, complexity, right? This is directly related to my first point, but I'm putting it as his own point because honestly it's more about mental stack versus actual cost. I recall when I first started just reading about real estate investing in general, the primary appeal being, you can use mortgages and amplify the effect of whatever amount of capital that I had, right? So essentially, the higher the home equity I could get a hold of, the better. At the same time, the more units that I could manage, the better my returns would be, so I thought. The problem with combining those two elements is that it implies a lot of increased complexity. For example, current moment in time, I only have to deal with one tenant, and that's a mild annoyance every year, okay, when it comes to renewal and paperwork. But to really get to a more, sustainable, higher amount of recurring stream of income from many units, let's say anywhere that's more than 10, right, landlording starts to become, well, on average, a full-time job. Because you're likely to have to turn over basically You might have a turnover every month instead of once a year. Landlord can actually feel worse than a regular job in this scenario, okay? Because at your regular job, remember, if your employer is at least somewhat competent, your work should be distributed relatively evenly through multiple employees or time frames. But if you're an individual landlord of more than 10 units, not only can things go wrong at any given moment, they can actually go wrong occasionally all at the same time, thus overwhelming a single landlord's ability to accommodate. Yeah, I mean, it's unlikely but possible. And sudden spikes will increase any individual investor's anxiety level, so not something to look forward to at all. And finally, I think the biggest con of real estate investing, at least as an individual investor, is the lack of diversification, right? At least compared to the other big common way to get to FIRE, which is just index investing in the stock market, okay? No matter how many units you have, if you're an individual landlord, it will never ever be diversified enough in the grand scheme of things. And that should be obvious, but I'm going to state it anyway. There is, of course, right now, a physical limit on how much mortgage you can take out. And even if you got, like, say, a handful of fourplexes to maximize your unit count, it will at best be diversified in the context of like one neighborhood in a city. Not even a city, just a neighborhood. And if you were just like me, who bought real estate simply to live in and perhaps moved around a bit, so maybe you can even have multiple units in multiple states or cities, right? But I still wouldn't call that diversified enough, right? This is in reality a question of opportunity cost, right? It doesn't mean that we're comparing it. It doesn't mean as much, right? Unless we're comparing to something like index funds. In index funds, you're betting on hundreds of companies, if not thousands of companies, in dozens of industries with millions of customers. In real estate investing, if you're doing it as an individual, you at best deal with dozens of tenants, aka customers, at any given time. Now, one can argue the other side in this debate and say, hey, at least with tenants you can screen them personally, unlike the customer bases of companies that you're simply investing in, right? But the point of diversification as a concept is that we're assuming that all things are fallible, especially people, and over large numbers, some people and some enterprises will turn out to be duds, right? That sounds depressing, but it's totally okay, even in that case when some fails, because you would be diversified. You're much more protected on the downside than if you're not diversified. So that's the weakness in a nutshell. If you're buying properties with leverage as a single, entity, household, whatever investor, it's simply impossible to be remotely diversified as you would by betting on the entire economies of scales of like the developed world. Okay? So in conclusion, can you win at real estate investing? Oh, absolutely. It would just take a much more specialized type of skill set to be a competent landlord, and navigating that whole upfront cost to begin that gravy train, not to mention a much more narrow risk tolerance profile, right, to mitigate the lack of diversification. I'm absolutely sure that some people's personalities will make a better fit with this style of investing, right? But what it's not is actually all that passive, right, after all the things that I've mentioned. And frankly, I am also just too lazy to devote that much of my life to being a landlord, at least to making being a landlord feel easy, okay? Now, as I've gotten a handful of years into my post-FIRE life, honestly, all I've ever wanted to do was deal less with the actual portfolio management part of life, not more. So real estate, it's still a good asset to have, as long as I think a reasonable minority of your portfolio, right? For me, it's just not worth it to be the linchpin of my portfolio. If you guys agree, disagree, please let me know in the comments below. Till next time, cheers. I'll approach it.